in people's lives. So, you shall not castrate a bull on the 3rd day and the 5th day of the 4th night, on 3 days of Tissa and 1 day of Chaturmasi. It's a very, very interventionist mindset. And it is perfect because that is what Nehru wanted to do. So basically, this new emerging group of people, because it suited their political view, began to build up Ashoka as this early socialist from the 3rd century BC, and quietly brushed all the nasty things about him in the history books into the under the carpet. And so was born Ashoka the Great. Now, some of you may be thinking that this fellow, Sanjeev Sannyas, is a real conspiracy theorist. But always remember that, Pandit Nehru was very aware of myth building. He was himself writing his own histories. Remember, he is a man who awarded himself the Bharat Ratna. If you don't believe me, again, use your phones, look it up when he got the Bharat Ratna. 1955. Who was the Prime Minister of India in 1955? Now, this happens to be, incidentally, India's highest civilian award. In fact, India's highest award, period. And the procedure is, the Prime Minister of India personally writes to the President recommending the name of the person. So I can imagine what the letter looked like. So somebody tried to RTI and get the letter, but I'm telling you what I think the letter must have read like. Dear President Radhakrishna, Sir, yesterday I met a nice chap called Jawahar. He's a jolly nice chap. We should definitely award him the Bharat Ratna. Love and kisses, Nehru. Now, you really think this guy couldn't have done it? Guess what? While he was Prime Minister, he instituted Children's Day on his own birthday. Don't believe it? The first Children's Day is in 1953. On his own birthday, he instituted Children's Day. Of course, we all know he loved his own children. So, which brings me back to what this talk is really about. The point is that Indian history, as you read it in your textbooks, is really layer on layer on layer of nonsense. And consequently, because we know that there's something somewhat unsavory about the whole thing, we end up giving the impression that we don't care about our history. In fact, we really do care about our history if we are told the truth. The good news is that you happen to live in a time that a lot of this information is becoming much more easily available. An amateur like me can hunt down important facts. In fact, since I've given up on the history departments, I'm hoping the engineering department will take this up and begin to investigate some of the original facts and evidences on which many of the very big major events of our history are based. And you'll be surprised to the extent to which a lot of this is twisted and turned in various ways. Now, of course, all history is told from some perspective. There's nothing wrong with that. Everybody is allowed their own opinion. But everybody is not allowed, in fact, nobody is allowed their own facts. So, since there is always a debate about how history books should be written or whether or not they should be revised, my view would be, using the argument that the current government may come up and put right-wing biases in it, is no excuse for perpetuating colonial era or Marxist era or socialist era biases. What we do need to do is to have a much more genuine debate about our own history. I think the only way that this can be achieved is by doing the following thing. First, let us agree on what the evidence is and be honest about it and present it honestly. Whatever it says, good, bad, ugly, present it reasonably honestly. Then, after that, allow for a multitude of different interpretations of that history to be presented. Unfortunately, because of a variety of reasons, using state patronage, much of this history has been only a one stream that is presented and embedded into our textbooks and then consequently into the general discussion. I think they should allow for multiplicity. As long as they are reasonable views and they are based on the evidence, I think this should be allowed. After all, we do not mostly even agree about things that happened last week. Just watch Arnab Goswami every evening. How on earth do you expect us to agree with what happened 2,500 years ago? Obviously, we do not agree. So it is okay to disagree. But what we have to do at least is to be honest about the facts. And then all reasonable views should be accepted. A multiple of them should be presented. Now, there is a good thing that will come out of all of this. One is, of course, it will be more honest. But the other thing is that history will now become much more interesting. It will become an exploration of the past rather than a memorization of random dates. Really, frankly, I couldn't care less about the Morley Minto reform or Akbar's Mansabdari system if I could learn about much more interesting things. So I think that would be what would happen, is that we would get much more flexibility, much more exploratory in the way we think about our past. But I think in the end, it is very, very important for us in order to keep this civilization alive, to feel pride for it, we need to tell our own story. Because remember, as an old African saying goes, until the lions have their own storytellers, the history of the world will always glorify the hunter. Thank you. I'm very happy to answer questions. Yes, the gentleman there. Does somebody have a mic or something? Yeah.
Hello.
Okay. Writing? Okay. So why I got interested in history is actually through a completely different line. I'm not a person who liked history in school, but later in life I began to discover that history matters in many ways, because without understanding one's history, i.e. where one came from, one cannot explain where one is going. So I got interested in that, and then I began digging up various things over time. I live in Southeast Asia, I live in Singapore, and for example, it's amazing how much influence there is of India all over Southeast Asia. I mean, I live in a city called Singapore. If you go through Indonesia, right next door is Indonesia. There's enormous influence of Indian civilization in Indonesia and across Southeast Asia, so much so that when Indonesians became free, they named their kingdom, their new country after us. They named their currency, the rupiah, after our currency. So this is not some theoretical influence. It is a real living influence. So I thought that it is important to begin exploring this. And as I began to explore this, I discovered that you can begin to think about the whole thing in a completely different way. So that is the answer to your first question. So what was the second? Nonsensical history. I don't think they're nonsensical at all, you see. It's a lot to do with myth building and how you create impressions and debates and end up framing the debate. For example, you will hear very often in colonial history that India is not a country, that it's a geographical term, that it has never been a nation. Now, it is true that the present boundaries and the present nation state of India is born in 1947. But there is plenty of evidence in our history to show that we have been conscious of being a civilization, a civilizational nation for a very long time. And we are not even unique in that. The Chinese, for example, have been very conscious of being Chinese for a very, very long time. Now, their boundaries as they stand today is new. This was also true of the Jews, who didn't even have a territory, but they have had a memory of being a civilizational nation for a long time. The Greeks had such a sense of themselves as a civilizational nation. Sparta and Athens fought with each other all the time, but whenever the Persians turned up, they united and fought them. So this idea of a civilizational nation is not new. So why is it that even today, very often scholars will perpetuate this myth about us not being a nation? I mean, I understand why the British did it, because that justified their rule, but why do we do it? The reason is, you see, if we existed as a nation before 1947, you can't have a father of the nation. And if you cannot have a father of the nation, you cannot have a chacha of the nation. It has got a lot to do with the myth building of how you say that we created this country and therefore you owe it to us to allow us to rule it forever. And therefore, alternative histories of India simply swept under the carpet. And I'll just give you a few examples. You never hear about major movements towards contributions to Indian history from alternative sources, like, for example, the revolutionaries. There was a major thing, none of our history books tell us about the Gadar movement, which was a huge movement, which came, in fact, within 72 hours of causing a major revolt, which may indeed have succeeded. We are not, very few of you would have even heard of the Great Naval Revolt of 1946, which has happened in living memory. It happened in 1946. 18,000 sailors across India, but particularly in Bombay, revolted in 1946. They were war veterans. Remember, this is just after the Second World War. They took control of a large number of battleships. They're fully armed, and they basically declared independence. And if they wanted, they could have taken control of large parts of India without working very hard, because when the British government of the time told the Indian Army and the Royal Indian Air Force to attack them, they refused. But it is very inconvenient to our myth-making that this event, rather than other events, led to our independence. So therefore, almost nobody is told about this. I'm quite certain many of you have never heard about this naval revolt. Even worse, both the soldiers of the Indian National Army and the sailors of the naval revolt were all dismissed from, of course, their forces. But even after independence, which happened just a year later, none of them were taken back in. And many of them died in dire poverty. Why? Because they did not fit the dominant stream of history. It's absolutely pathetic, but that is how, unfortunately, our history was written. So it does matter. This is not nonsensical history. It's deliberately done. Yes? Okay, what was the first question, sorry? Actually, the Mongols did invade India. There were several rounds of them. The first and earliest round was that they invaded Delhi, and they defeated Alauddin Khilji and essentially pushed him into the Siri fort. He was stuck there for 6 months. He just about survived it. So the Mongols did come. Then a few hundred years later, the Mongols came back. Remember, Mughals were Mongols. That's where the word comes from. So Babur was a Mongol. So they did come to India a little bit later from the Genghis Khan period, but in a later period, and they did set up an empire in India and did have an influence on our civilization. So it is not the case that the Mongols didn't come. They came in 2 waves, and in the second wave, they did stay for a pretty long period of time. So that is the first question. The second question is about Gandhi. Yes, I mean, I am a big votary of thinking about alternative ways of thinking about history. We will perhaps tomorrow find out something quite interesting about the whole thing, about Netaji, for example, although I wouldn't hold my breath, because I think all the interesting files have long disappeared. But nevertheless, the point is there are alternative ways of thinking about history.